there would be such an outcry that I'm not sure that it really has much purchase, but it certainly gives some inclination into the autocratic leanings of some, if not all, of the ANC.
KwaZulu-Natal Premier Sihle Zikalala has openly criticized South Africa's constitutional democracy. He has called for a return to a parliamentary system. Joining me to discuss is Sara Gon of the Daily Friend. So Sara, what were some of Premier Zikalala's comments and why should we flag those as a potential risk?
Okay, there were two things. One was that he criticized the courts for overreach. And then all is revealed when he says, and I quote, "It is time we should debate whether the country does not need parliamentary democracy, where laws enacted by Parliament should be above all and not reviewed by another organ," close quote. And he basically pointed to the fact that Britain doesn't have a written constitution. I'm not sure that he knows very much about Britain because it has a constitution, although it's evolved through the law and essentially is oral and reflected in case law. He's clearly, and particularly with reference to the court, he's clearly, on behalf of the ANC, he's throwing out the idea that the constitution creates parity between the courts, the legislature and the cabinet. All three sections are meant to sort of act as a bit of a check on each other so that they don't overreach and disadvantage the citizenry in the process. And clearly, I think what Zikalala is doing is he's taking the fact that the ANC's quality of governance has deteriorated so badly, and including but not limited to their performance often in the courts where legislation or regulations are thrown out for being unconstitutional or a decision is taken against an argument for a certain interpretation that the government has given to law. And that's essentially what he's doing. What he wants to say is, if we get rid of the constitution, then the courts will lose their authority over the parliament. And so, in other words, whatever they do in parliament, which is predominantly in the hands of the ANC, is what will stand, whether it's constitutional or not. It doesn't. But if you get rid of the constitution, then you certainly don't have to worry about the constitution. And the courts that uphold the constitution getting in the way of anything that the ANC wants to do. The consequence, obviously, of being very dangerous for democracy. And in fact, in a sense, your democracy will diminish. And what he should have rather been referring to as an example is that the apartheid government ruled by parliamentary supremacy. So particularly after the 1961 Constitution was enacted, and it stated that no court of law shall be competent to inquire into or pronounce upon the validity of any act passed by Parliament. And that's really what they want, to basically literally do whatever they want, with there being no check by the courts and no limitation by the terms of the Constitution. So either you're doing it for an ideological reason, as the Nats did, or you're really trying to get away with poor governance without anybody or any organ of state being able to hold you to account. And it is dangerous and populist stuff.
So Sara, this is also reminiscent of comments made by Lindiwe Sisulu, where she was openly criticizing the courts as a obstacle to transformation. And so I think there's an emerging trend here of scapegoating the justice system and diverting attention away from the governance failures of the party itself.
No, it is. And it's also very much a theme that's coming out of the so-called RET faction of the ANC. So they're obviously taking this line of going away from democracy and into something more of an autocracy, because she's identified with it, as has Sihle Zikalala has very strongly been identified as being a Zuma man. So this may very well end up being a real battle between the two factions of the ANC. And I think it's really the RET faction versus the Cyril faction. I don't think we can call it the reformist faction. And perhaps it might be the basis on which the Cyril faction actually adds to its arsenal, let me put it this way, in the fight against the RET faction is the support for the separation of powers and for keeping the constitution where it deserves to be. But I'm not sure at this stage. I think we'll see more of this coming up as we get to each set of conferences, of the ANC's conferences during the course of this year.
Right, Sara. Well, I think what's very interesting here is the ANC's discomfort with the very idea of democracy. I think they see democracy actually as majoritarianism, rule by the majority, and have very little patience for the constraints on power, the checks and balances that something like the Constitution brings. But this is also reminiscent of South Africa's past. In the apartheid system, also had parliamentary supremacy, and that meant that the National Party could gerrymander the districts, could stack the courts again with sympathetic judges. There were a lot of ways in which those checks and balances were actually limited and reduced. And we saw the consequence of that in terms of the apartheid policies. So do you think there's a danger here that we might swing back to a kind of a less democratic dispensation in South Africa?
I think there is a very real risk, partly because I think the instincts of the ANC have always been to hold sway, to be as answerable as little as possible. I mean, it's not to say that they would not be entirely held to account by the courts, but if you don't have that undergirding piece of legislation that creates quite distinct markers for a government to reach, it just increasingly makes it much easier for them to do what they want to do with less accountability. That's, of course, exactly. I mean, let's put it this way: the apartheid era took this to its nth degree, with very little opposition available in Parliament, and a law that said the courts cannot review decisions made by Parliament. Anything could and did happen, and the way the ANC is governed, the state the country is in, suggests that they would be very tempted to do it because they try and make up for the deficit in actual performance.
Yeah, and I think that in many ways the National Party of old and the ANC share that characteristic of being nationalist movements. The National Party was a white nationalist, and the ANC is an African nationalist movement. But and there has been that small liberal space that characterized the transition, where the Bill of Rights was introduced, and many other of the kind of legal and constitutional protections. But those are being squeezed by the ANC, especially as they lose their power and control.
And they joined. I mean, the EFF would be also a great proponent of having no constitution. But I think one of the difficulties that the government now, as opposed to an apartheid government, would have had is we've had 27 years of pretty much free speech, media being free to say what it likes. People can express any opinion they like and not be jailed for it or banned as they used to. So I think the reality of the possibility of sort of contracting the constitution or removing it completely, there would be such an outcry that I'm not sure that it really has much purchase, but it certainly gives some inclination into the autocratic leanings of some, if not all, of the ANC.
Sara Gon, thank you very much. Let's hand over to you, our audience. What do you make of Premier Zikalala's comments? What do they reflect about the ANC's attitude towards constitutional democracy? Do share your thoughts in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. My name is David Ansara. This is the CRA. Until next time, take care.